We are blowing the whistle today, my friends. I have with me retired, well, not technically retired firefighter, Patrick Steele from Las Vegas, Nevada. He is a third-generation firefighter. He served for 20 years, and then 12 years ago, when he started calling attention to the fraud in the fire department, he was escorted off the property. He has been trying to have his story told for over 12 years now, as he has paid a severe price for trying to educate the public on what's really going on with firefighter fraud and how our tax dollars are being illegally used to fund pensions and overtime pay that really don't exist. And we're going to let Patrick explain what he means by that. So I want to welcome our very special guest today, Patrick Steele. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. So what I would like to do is, for the listener's sake, will you start with your family's background as a third-generation firefighter, and then also how they, I believe it was your grandfather that started the Firefighters Union. Will you take us back and just lay the groundwork on your family's history with firefighting?
Okay, I'll try to, if I get off track, to straighten me out.
Okay.
When my grandparents moved from Chicago to Las Vegas, they opened a restaurant and met the chief here in Nevada, Chief Clark, and in his restaurant, the Billard's Family Restaurant on Main Street. It's just, that's where the firefighters would meet. Mm-hmm. And that's how my family met them. And as my family, I don't know if you'd call, got out of the Navy and got back to the restaurant, running the restaurant, and the fire department needed to expand to cover as the Las Vegas Strip grew away from the city and went more south, out 5th Street, or the Strip is what it is. But mm-hmm. Back then, there was 7 fire hydrants on the Strip altogether. Now you'd see more than that in a parking lot nowadays. So the Billers were in fire prevention. They worked with Chief Clark, and after my dad got out of the Navy, he got on the fire department. He became a battalion chief, and as a child or the son of a firefighter, you're taken to the station. You see how cool it is. You see everything that goes on, including the fire trucks themselves, the sirens, the lights, so on and so forth. And one day I said, I'm going to drive the fire truck one day. And so I just followed in the family's footsteps, and eventually I got on the fire department. Before I got on the fire department, I was in a community college paramedics class. I took fire science classes and some other stuff, and tried to lay the foundation of otherwise what I thought would be important to be an asset if I was hired. Mm-hmm. That's what I was doing.
And so in what year did you become a firefighter?
1991, around the time Desert Storm. The name of our rookie school class was the Desert Storm -2 or something like that. You know, all of our photographs from the rookie school all have Desert Storm written on all of our, you know, where it shows the guys, hey, let's take some pictures today in front of the training tower or whatever.
Okay. And did you mention to me before when we were talking that your grandfather started the Firefighters Union? Did I get that correct?
My father did. Back then, the fire department didn't pay a lot of money. He made like $60, $70 a month. And the house payment back then was $75 a month. And my father couldn't afford $75 a month house payment. So they lost the house. They moved into a smaller house over by on Boulder Highway, what was called the Showboat Hotel and Casino. It's no longer there, but we lived behind that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't know what a 4 or 5 or 600 square foot house, you know, in today's standards, but that's how we lived until my dad said, you know, in order to make better pay, we should organize as a union. and then they picketed in front of the Stewart building down. It's a Zappos place now. It's a Zappos shoe place, but in the 60s, they would stand out in front of there. We need better working conditions. We need a little bit better pay. And working with the American Federation of Labor Unions, the AFL, and my dad started the union in the 60s.
Okay, and so was that specifically for the Las Vegas area, or did he start the labor union for the firefighters all across the United States and they followed suit?
This is just here in Nevada. Okay. And although it's Las Vegas itself sits in a tiny little area called the Paradise Township, but Clark County is the name of the fire department that I worked for. You know, most people, if you said Clark County, wouldn't really know that that's Las Vegas.
Okay, and how was your career? As you were a firefighter, how were you in terms of your employment? Were you in good standing? Did you enjoy your time as a firefighter?
I don't know. I would say that the job was incredibly fun. You know, it was an exciting job. You know, growing up as the grandson of a fireman and the son of a fireman, you see things that other people don't see. The average person just sees the good parts about the fire department, the fire truck, or the sirens and pull to the right as they approach and you see them in the mirror, that kind of stuff. But the average person and the politics associated with being a fireman is it's not always, I don't know, roses and fairy tale. I don't know how to explain it, but there are some gray areas, but that comes with living at the fire station for 24 hours and being without your dad for 24 hours or your mom having to do things and it just is what it is.
So when did you start noticing that something was awry, that everything wasn't as glamorous and rosy as you thought from the outside, even though you had an insider's perspective from your family's history? When did you and your career start to notice that things were a little bit off? And what were those things?
You mean in terms of what goes on within the fire department or the salary and the pay?
Well, let's talk about it within the fire department first, and then we'll move into the manipulation of pay.
Okay, well, the easiest way to say it is how the fire department worked here in Clark County was you had what was called a work cycle, and at the beginning of each year you were given a work card, and it shows that A and B and C platoon will work, in each platoon will work 10 days a month, 10 24-hour shifts, 10 out of 30 days, and you'll be paid a fixed amount per what it says in the contract. And as a young kid, I didn't know all that stuff, A and B and C platoon. I just knew that I was the son of a fire chief, and people would come by the house on their day off, and they would go to the lake and take a ice chest full of beer, and we would stay out there for 2 or 3 days until they got sunburned or one of the motors didn't go right, and everyone would come back to town, and then they would do it all again on the next 6th day. How it works is you work a day, you're off a day, you work a day, you're off a day. You do that for 5 times, and then you get a 6th day off. You're off for 6 days in a row, and then it repeats. So basically, a fireman works 10 days a month here in Clark County. That's what their work card says.
That's it?
That's it. But as you'll learn, it's more sophisticated than that. Now that with software, it's much different.
Okay, so let's talk about the software, because I didn't know anything like that existed until I had spoken to you. So tell us a little bit about this software, what's it called, and then how firefighters are using it to manipulate their pay schedule.
Okay. Well, when I got on the fire department, in order to get any overtime, the chief had to approve it, the battalion chief of each platoon. You had an A and a B and a C platoon, and whether, depending on what side of town you were on, you were in battalion 1, battalion 2, battalion 3, battalion 6, whatever you were in. And that chief of that battalion would determine whether or not, looking at a roster, who gets callbacks and who doesn't. If someone gets a callback, then he gets back to the bottom of the list, and then the next guy, it's his turn. And what it did was it allowed people who didn't want to take overtime to just say, no, I don't want to call back, and the chief would go to the next guy, and if someone wanted to be aggressive, they could take overtime. Most people don't take any overtime on the fire department until they get into their last 3 years and get close to retirement, and they try to boost their last 3 years because your retirement is based on the top 3 years that you work.
Oh.
So a lot of the senior guys try to take callbacks on the weekends, or they try to take a callback at the airport, or they try to take a callback at one of the stations that's less busy. And the software and some other things do that now, but back then the chief just picked up the phone, or he had the chief's driver or the chief's assistant make those calls. Hey, would you like to call back this morning? Yes or no? And you either say yes or no and decline or accept. And if you do, you take your turnouts, so your fire department safety gear, home with you on your days off. So if you did get a call back, you don't have to drive back to the station and get it. You can just drive right to wherever you're going to be assigned.
Okay. So at what point was this software instituted where the captain was no longer keeping track of all of this by a ledger book and a phone? Now it's computerized. When did that happen? And what is the software called?
Well, most people today, they just think that the internet has always existed and cell phones have always existed, and they haven't. When I got on the fire department, there was no computers, there was no cell phones. It was just, you pick up and dial, and so on and so forth. The easiest way to say it is the computer. The first thing that got invented was the computer. We had interdepartment computers called group-wise, where like a chief could send something out that says, okay, there's going to be an update to an SOP or a rule or a reg or something like that. And here's the update. If you would like, you could print this page, and it would come out on like a triplicate form thing out of an old-fashioned, like something you'd see from old NASA days. It looked primitive. And it was black and with green letters, green, nothing like we have today. Well, as the internet got invented, and like everyone would get AOL, and there was dial-up, and the internet began, they started a callback software program, and it was called web staffing.
Okay.
Web staffing. And when the cell phone got invented, it got really sophisticated, and it became telestaff, short for telephone staffing. And one of our, let me just say that she was a sort of a supervisor at the time. She was sent to Massachusetts or Boston, wherever web staffing and telephone staffing is located. And she trained on the software for about a year, and then came back and gave us classes on it. And that was in the 90s. And then we got closer to 2000. The sophistication of the software and the complexity of overtime and people wanting to work and not work, it really got out of hand. Next thing you know, a fireman whose contract says under firefighter or engineer or captain, whatever rank that you had, you fell into a category, like category 72 pay scale, category 78 pay scale, category 81 pay scale.
What does all that mean?
It's just a number they would input that say, okay, this individual falls under pay scale 81. It might mean captain or supervisor under the public employees system of allocating pay to a contractual agreement, but it's your base pay.
Okay.
And when you have people sitting around the station for a long time and not doing anything, the first thing they can come up with is new ways to make money. So some guys run a business out of the fire department. Some guys have a side job where they spend a lot of time on the computer. I feel like I'm getting off track. I want to stay
stay with the software, because I want us to understand how this works and then how it's been manipulated.
Okay, basically the software that took the place of the battalion chief making the callbacks allows the battalion chief to no longer be held accountable for anything that goes wrong. And what it does is it establishes what I call plausible deniability, where if something went wrong and someone got caught for taking something they shouldn't, the software could be blamed. But my fear as a third generation fireman was that down the road, when all of this finally does come out, you know, the Ponzi scheme or the racketeering and the fraud, they're just going to say, oh, well, Fire Chief Steele started the union and it's been that way ever since, when it hasn't. You know, there was no computers in the 60s. There was no cell phones in the 60s. The software didn't exist.
So you want to make sure that your grandfather's name is cleared, or your father's name.
Well, I've seen when people get caught, the first thing they say is, well, the other guy did it. The other guy was doing it. Or they're trying to argue. At the fire department, one of the justifiers they use when they're caught is, well, that's past practice. No, racketeering and stealing taxpayer money is not past practice.
So let's talk about that. Tell us exactly how the software can be manipulated so that these firemen are getting paid for time spent on the job that they really did not do. Tell us about that.
Okay, what the software does is it allows the base pay to be accelerated by 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 times the base pay's legal scale. And how it's done is they add attachments to the base pay. And these attachments are classified as 5%, 10%, 15% increases to the base pay. And they're called premium pay attachments. And if the person has these entered into the software program, anytime that person is given a callback or is given overtime, they get the double time and a half plus the 10 or the 15 or those stackable premium pays. Although in the contract it says no stacking of premium pay can be allowed, but in fact they do just that. And then according to the politicians who've put new legislation in place, such as the lawyer who is the lawyer for the lobbyist for our fire union, who is in Carson City and has negotiated special legislation making it impossible for the public to look at the contracts that they're stuck paying for. They've made it nearly impossible for the public to learn what really goes on. There's a place here in Vegas called NPRI, Nevada Policy Research Institute. It's supposed to be like a think tank investigative person or group tries to look into and get to the bottom of what really goes on. But I've learned that not only do they not tell the truth, they actually help the unions avoid being caught. And I think that their silent owners would be something like maybe the Mendenhalls or the Koch brothers. I don't know where their funding really totally comes from, but there's a group of people in very high places that benefit from what Nevada Policy Research does not expose to the public.
How do you know they're aiding them? What evidence do you have that shows that?
About 10, 12 years ago, 2006, 2007, I went there asking if they would take me public to blow the whistle. I gave them a whole bunch of information, and the guy says, yeah, I'll help you once you give me some information. Next thing I know, he took the information, went back to the union, and told the union what I was trying to do to make sure that the union stayed one step ahead and didn't get caught. So shortly after I met with them, the legislators in Carson City put new laws in place, and their argument was under a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which is the claim or the argument that the fire department bases all of its justifications on. The public cannot review the contracts. Everything is allowed to be negotiated behind closed doors, and the public can't see the contracts that they're stuck funding. They can get like a basic overview of it, like a pamphlet that says, yeah, the firemen work 10 days a month and they get 6 days off in a row before they have to return back, but they don't get into the sophistication that an insider would know, someone who's actually lived it and seen just how complex it gets.
So what is the actual base salary for most firefighters? I know that's going to vary from state to state, and depending
In
on your
Clark County,
level.
it's about 50 to 65,000 a year. That's the
Okay.
start pay, and then after you pass your first year probation, you can begin to take callbacks and things like that. But in very little time, with those stacking of the premium pay, the first year fireman makes probably nearly 200,000. And when you accelerate the base pay, that individual, when they're hired, they can quickly buy 5 years from the public employees retirement system, which basically gives them 6 years on the book after their first year on. So an employee can work only 20, buy 5, and immediately start collecting a very large pension, and then get hired back at the fire department again as an instructor or an advisor or uh, an EMS assistant or infectious coordinator, these bizarre titles. And it says right in the public employees retirement system, there's no double dipping. You can't get 2 pensions, but some people are getting 3 and 4, and you know, it can really get sophisticated. I even worked with one guy who used 2 names and was getting 2 paychecks. And when I questioned,
How is this happening? How is that software being manipulated to the point where this is even possible? And who
well,
knows about this?
the firemen aren't going to tell on themselves for the amount of money they're taking home. They're just not. But when it does come out and the public sees how much money, they're going to bring in a forensic accountant, they're going to crunch the numbers, and they're going to make the public get their money back. They're going to reduce the people's property taxes that were increased to fund it, the gas taxes that were increased to fund it, just all these skimmings, and you know, there's got to be a word for it, but I just call it racketeering because it's a group of people working together to steal money. But I don't know if that's the definition of racketeering, but when the group of people are working to do what they do, it's not what was intended. And the I don't know if it would be elaborate or I'm kind of a loss at words, but it's not what the public is paying for. They're they're getting a service, but this easiest way to say it is the public is paying the cost of 10 fire departments to get the result of 1 fire department.
So the article that you sent me, one of the articles that I read talked about an example of this firefighter who had, I think it was a payout of an excessive 200,000 plus, and he had logged in that he had worked over 9,000 hours for the year when really there are not that many hours in the year. So how is this being able to continue to go on, and how common is that? What
Well,
percentage of the firefighters do you feel are manipulating this software?
at this point at the county, all of them are doing it. What they did was they found, in order for what used to be called the firemen, and in a way to cloak it or not let the people understand who's really doing it, is to just generalize the name and call everyone first responders. And then when you hire very expensive lobbyists to market the fire union constantly, whether it's in Washington, D.C., at the high levels of the AFL-CIO with Trumka, at the International Firefighter Association levels, or at the local levels, there's a rank that you achieve where there's like, I want to use my hand as a description, but you know, there's the group above here that knows what's going on, and then there's the Indians down here that are kept in the dark, and they're just told this is the way it's been, this is how it'll be, and that's not how it was. It's just, before you get hired, they do kind of like a background check on you, and if you're have more of a sheeple mindset, or if you drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, you are more accepted. You pass the background check and then you get hired. And the other hiring process that you've seen is more nepotistic, where, you know, there's, if you look at some of the people who are on the fire department, you'll see that their parents or their relatives are the district attorneys, the son of the sheriff, the son of the mayor, the relatives of very high ranking people. Like the gaming control board has family on the, because they know that once their child is placed in the fire department, it's a golden goose, so to speak. And the sophistication doesn't just stop at the cooking of the salary and pensions and work rosters, because after you work 20, you buy 5 years, and you immediately start collecting your pension, which could be $15,000-$20,000 a month. Some of these people, they're hired right back for a second pension, even though it says you can't do that. And so in order to hide that, some of the tricks that I've seen is they'll set up an agency in California. They'll subcontract the individual out. They'll mail that second pension check to California. California skims 1 or 2% off the top of it, and then mails the balance back to the employee who shouldn't be getting the second taxpayer-funded pension in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And in the contract, what's also written is once you retire, every 4 years after you retire, you get a 6% cost of living raise added to your retirement.
Well, that's nice.
And the individual that gave us the classes on how to manipulate the software and use the software, there was an investigation where that individual was terminated, or to avoid termination, she voluntarily resigned to avoid prosecution. I don't know, but you could look in these newspaper articles. I could send you the links to them, and people could read it themselves and see what's going on. But after 3.5 years of retirement, where she voluntarily resigned, she argued that she needed to be hired back because she was treated unfairly. So they hired her back and gave her $500,000 back pay. The only problem is they had promoted other people to the position that she vacated. So now those people had to be placed in new roles, like an administrative battalion chief, or an underwater basket weaving battalion chief, or, pencil sharpening battalion chief, something to that effect.
And so the taxpayers are funding this fraud.
Well, what she wanted was the $500,000 added to her top 3 years, which I don't know if that gives you $25,000 or $30,000 a month pension, but you could see in no time at all just how bankrupt the public could be when the software is put in place. The city union brought the software in first, and then our union president at the time moved into administration, went upstairs as a manager, and brought in a useful idiot president of the union who funneled the paperwork to him. He stamped and approved it, and then they brought the telestaff onto our computers, and then we started using it. And then that individual who was the president of our union at the time, his wife was moved from a accounting job she had on the Strip to North Las Vegas. North Las Vegas then received the software, and although North Las Vegas has only been using the software a few years, they're already $27 million unfunded in the pensions, because there's more money going out than is coming in. So when you have the lawmakers that tell you that higher taxes are the answer to everything, and then when you look behind the scenes and find out those legislators are also the lawyer for the fire union lobbyists, you can see just how high this goes, to where these individuals are making sure that no matter what they do, it can't be looked into. And their argument now, since 9/11, under the Patriot Act, the fire department declares themselves as a division of the military under Department of Homeland Security. So they're arguing that their salary and their pay and their contracts can no longer be looked at by the public who's forced to fund them. And
How did they get away with that? I did not know that they were listed as an arm of the military.
that's their argument. And when you try to bring it up, they'll use words like, well, we're a quasi-military organization. And people are misled because they hear the word military, and quasi-military doesn't mean it's a division of the military. It simply means that when there's a chief and there's chiefs that are under him and the span of control is exceeded, you can delegate some authorities to those lower ranking chiefs. Like an assistant chief can make a decision for the chief because there's just too much to do. And that's the real definition of quasi-military. It just means that some decisions can be made by lower ranking. It doesn't mean you're in the military.
Mm-hmm.
But when you try to defy the union, the first responders union, who's taken over and has decided that the answer to everything is to cook the books and take the money, when you try to speak out against them, they'll say, well, this is a quasi-military organization and you can't question us at any level. And the backlashes are this, and when I did, my life in its current state is the result. But
So when they're going through the hiring process, not only are they looking for individuals who can physically do the job and psychologically do the job, but they're also looking for individuals that will keep their secret and participate.
well, they wouldn't look at it as a keep a secret. They'll try to tell everyone that this is the way it's always been and we've always done it this way, and no one can have a 6-day anymore. There's mandatory callbacks, and if you try to say I don't want to take a callback today, they'll say that's according to the telestaff policy under Scorch the Earth, you must take this callback or else.
Were you not threatened or at least passively aggressively encouraged to keep the secret about this software? Didn't you tell me something along those lines?
Well, I don't know if you're hinted to that. I just recognized what was going on and realized it was wrong. The average person should be able to say, as the contract dictates, if I want to take a day off, I take a day off. Well, these people who are falsifying the records and creating these additional vacancies, they need somebody to fill those shoes. The problem being is those individuals who want you to work that vacancy are being paid for that same vacancy. What I mean by that is, let's say Rescue 18, it's a very busy rescue. Station 18 is busy. It serves a strip and it's takes a lot of calls. And so a lot of people don't want to ride the rescue. Well, they'll make a callback for that for a paramedic to fill the rescue unit, when in fact you got maybe 10 or 15 or 20 paramedics working upstairs already receiving paramedic pay that aren't doing the work. And one of the things that takes place because of those stacking of the premium pays is what was used to be known as rescue pay that you only receive when you drove or rode the rescue, has now been handed over to people who don't even ride the rescue. You're getting like an arson investigator doesn't run rescue calls, but they're getting rescue pay.
I see.
Fire prevention plans checkers are getting rescue first responder pay, but they don't run calls. They don't carry any equipment to deliver any EMS or ALS or basic life. They don't carry oxygen, laryngoscopes, nothing. And there's no need for them to maintain the EMS certifications because they're not doing their 13 IV sticks a month and all these other things. They're just falsifying records on a document called an F-15. They're submitting it to the health department. They have an insider at the health department who then approves it, and then everyone gets premium pay as a result of falsified records. And for over 15 years, we had an individual who was teaching our paramedic program, but he wasn't legally licensed to do so, which invalidates everybody who held a EMS certification at the fire department.
Can you give his name?
Oh, the individual who taught the courses, his name was Richard Hardman, and he worked with a chief named Steve Hansen. And Steve Hansen and him came up with a plan where nobody would be going to the community college like I did at Phyllis Belfast's paramedic training courses that were given, back in the 80s. And
So if he wasn't certified to teach these courses, then doesn't that render any sub-certification null and void?
yes, and when you try to go to the health department and get those records to come forward with it, suddenly you find out that the fire department had an insider at the health department. And no matter where you go, you can't get to the bottom of nothing because the fireman has an insider in that spot to make sure that you don't get anywhere.
So how long into your career before you started realizing that things weren't the way your dad had intended them to be with the union and that people were skimming?
That was in the 90s, because that's when the web staffing started. And then initially the first people who were starting to take advantage of it started to infiltrate the union, and that's when the first responders basically took over the firefighters union. Today, if you hear the word first responder in any news, local news, newspaper, national news story, you're hearing a pre-packaged story that the fire union lobbyists have come together and created, so that anytime they're marketing themselves subconsciously to the public, you're hearing the word first responder. And anything that's associated with that is basically I don't know if you would call it propaganda, but it's their way that they market themselves as the hero. Or if you question it any deeper than that, they'll say, well, 9/11, and so we're all heroes, when in fact not even very many of the people I worked with here went to the cleanup of 9/11, and that has its own darkness as well. We took two of those C-130 cargo planes from Nellis. One of them had some mechanical issues, so it landed at the staging area in Texas. The other one flew into New Jersey or wherever they did for the staging for that event. At the morning briefing, they were told, okay, we've already checked these places, and you guys on Nevada Task Force 1, we don't want you going over here. Don't touch this. We've already looked here. But instead of doing what they were told, they went and did what they wanted to do. So a couple hours after they were there, they basically made it into a photo op. They took pictures of themselves on heavy equipment and in sections of the building that had already been deemed unsafe or had already been checked. And then I didn't even know anything about this till these guys came back from that, had the photographs on the kitchen table at the station, we're going over it, and then find out later the people in New York sent those guys home. They said, look, we told you to do this. You didn't do anything we ordered you to do. You went in where it wasn't safe and you touched things we told you not to touch. So you guys go home. But they still got their Nevada Task Force 1 FEMA pay, which was $21,000 a week.
What? $21,000 a week?
Yeah, that's what it was initially. But right now it's about $26,000 per person per week, for when the Nevada Task Force 1 team is activated. And that's on
And
top.
how long do they sustain that pay for?
If the team gets activated for more than 15 minutes, they get an entire week's pay. So often you'll see they'll work for a week and 16 minutes. That way they'll get 2 weeks pay each. And what they do as soon as the team gets activated is they immediately abandon their station here. And that creates 80 to 100 vacancies here that also need callbacks filled here. And the task force will leave, and then our community locally is 80 to 100 people short, which time you have to force the mandatory callbacks on the other people who otherwise wouldn't be working. And that's just so the people can get overtime plus the FEMA pay.
So it's not just about those firefighters getting called to handle that emergency, but it's when the firefighters are getting called up to take their place. So it's multi-tiered fraud.
Oh, it's it's sophisticated, because there's a couple of guys that really know how to turn the money wheel, if that makes sense. They are very, very good at it. And these guys like to be in managerial positions. They're not actually running any calls and doing the work, but they sit in positions where they reap the benefits of the supervisory roles plus the overtime.
So how much can one of these individuals in the higher roles, how much can they make each year from stacking their fraud?
Well, when you really look at it, each person that has used the software, or the union has used the software to benefit each employee, each employee takes a different amount. It's not equal all across the board. You know, one guy may get more favoritism because he's the nephew of a very high ranking church member, let's say, for example. And that guy might get 2 paychecks, or he might get a job called a rural coordinator where he gets a company car and he can drive back and forth to St. George where he lives and drive back and forth and have access to the warehouse and all of the medical supplies that are not quite tracked as good as they should be, you know, things like that. But for an example, one of the highest paid guys was a guy, he had been on workers' comp for 8 years because he was mowing the lawn or something, broke a sprinkler. I don't know how he got on workers' comp, but he was on workers' comp for 8 years and he was making $650,000 a year. And your pension is based on those high numbers. And one of the things that takes place is when you've got 30% of your employees off on some sort of light duty or workers' comp type of certification, it creates overtime in the software program so other employees can schedule their overtime weeks, months, and years ahead of time, so they can schedule them around to where they get the maximum amount of pay and benefits out of it, so they don't cut into their FLSA periods. Their holiday pay isn't impacted. They can schedule their vacations around their overtime. And
I had no idea that firefighters were making this kind of money and that this was going on behind the scenes. And I know that this, and I didn't know this before I spoke with you, that this was all across the board happening through the United States and not just in Las Vegas. I have a family member who has a family member that is a firefighter in California. His name is Andy, and he's been ripping off the department and the public for many years. He had supposedly a knee issue, and he has been on disability, on full active payroll, but on disability, getting paid for at least 5 years now. He flies all over, makes all kinds of money. He's not doing shit with the fire department. He's getting on roofs, climbing up and down the ladders. If I were an insurance company, I would go after him for fraud, but he's taken it. I didn't realize that what kind of fraud he was pulling and how this was happening until I spoke to you. Then I was like, oh, that must be what he's doing. How can that be justified?
Without knowing the individual and the complexity of their local contracts and the software program or the name of the software program that person's using, I could just guesstimate that under CalPERS, the public employees like the firemen have something called the DROP program, the DROP program, where if someone is injured, they can sit around the office and take a pension plus work towards another pension. But to stay within my boundaries and the knowledge of my local area, I'll give you an example of what happened to me. I worked with an individual who had hepatitis and meningitis. And because meningitis can kill in less than 24 hours, I don't know the sophistication of or the level of exposure of the person that exposed us. But that person, the HIPAA laws is what they were used as the excuse why I couldn't find out the exposure. But at work, we came into work, we were told that you've been exposed to hepatitis and meningitis. You must be transported to the public University Medical Center by fire truck. So we're going to put the units out of service. We're going to drive over to the hospital where they took fluid out of my spine. And when they take fluid out of your spine to test it, I guess I'm one of the part of the population that has 1% of the population, their fluid doesn't replace, the synovial spine fluid doesn't replace itself. It's either that or there's a hole in it, according to a nurse. That's one of the people that I, without diagnosis and so on like that. But you could have what's called a leak, and your spine could need a patch, something to that effect. Well, anyways, the person who trained us on the software, that's the person I worked with, and I got the meningitis and the hepatitis exposures from. She was what was called a infectious coordinator, where if somebody was on a call and they stuck themselves accidentally with a needle when they were trying to recap it, she would go and investigate and fill out a C4 form or on the job injury report and whatever. But during that time frame, she got exposed, came to work, exposed us, and then it was, okay, this is a serious situation. Let's get you over to the hospital, do the spinal test. So my back became a problem, and they wouldn't cover it. They said, we don't know what happened to the work records or the medical records or any of this stuff. And so that girl ended up being promoted to a chief's position, and they brought a different girl in named Richie Jenkins. And she became the infectious coordinator. So I had her try to look into it. Can you at least get these medical records so that we can find out what type of exposures we really got? And she said, let's go get the logbooks. Well, the logbooks for those days were missing. Every day when you come into work, you're supposed to log, okay, today we had this many calls. You fill out your logbook. Today, this crew member was relieved by this one who was coming on, and this is what happened in that 24-hour period. Well, the logbooks for that time frame vanished. So when I spoke with the union president, and I saw him walking out the door with it, I was like, well, what's going on? The supervisor said, well, it's not too important. He's just taking the logbooks. Well, the logbooks never returned. So Richie Jenkins tried a different route to get to and she ended up at the UMC Quick Care on Russell and tried to get the answers, only to find out that Fire Chief Keating's brother, who runs UMC Quick Care, was making it impossible for her to get the answers that she needed to find out, why my back was messed up. And the more questions she had, eventually she got let go. And now I believe she lives in South Carolina. But was I ever able to get any medical records? No. And then the UMC had to be torn down so they could expand the airport. So they said during that time frame, all of the paper records were lost. So only the coworkers that you worked with are covered for the meningitis and hepatitis exposures, and there's no records for you, although we all worked at the same station.
So your records have completely disappeared.
What you're being told and what really, can I go and get records? No. Have I tried to get records? Yes. One of the people I did go to was a guy who's at the newspaper. I've been to more than one reporter. Years ago, I tried going to somebody famous in Las Vegas and for investigative reporting, and his name was George Knapp. He's a
coast to coast.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he goes, Pat, I can't help you. The Nelson family that owns Channel 8 won't let me help you. They wouldn't even let me get past the bulletproof glass on the magnetic lock doors at the KLAS place. I tried many times, different, and he couldn't help me. So I tried going to the newspapers. I went to the various people ahead of the Las Vegas Sun or the editors and stuff. And twice I even took a editor of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and his name is Glenn Cook. And when we were there, the Public Employees Retirement System, they simply notify the local authorities, at which time we're escorted off the property. They're not rude and no one gets arrested. You're just told that since you don't work here and there's nothing that can be given to you, you won't be helped. And since that time, they've moved the Public Employees Retirement System to Nye County. So it's basically in Pahrump. It's an 80-mile drive to even get to what would now be not paper but digital records. Mm-hmm. And that's where the software becomes an even bigger problem. Nowadays, mm-hmm. when people need answers, you shouldn't be able to just say, well, your digital records were lost. All that stuff that was a hard copy or something that was written down, can't be found, or suddenly it's got an addendum to it, or it's been altered in some way that makes you look like you did something you didn't.
So did this back incident end your career as a firefighter? Is that what
No.
brought everything to a head, or you were able to continue working after that?
Well, I got placed on light duty, and they said that you need to get off the property because we're not going to assist you. And no matter what I did, I couldn't get to the bottom of it. And that's when I had the altercations with the union officials. You know, these people who said, you know, you try to get them to do their job. They're elected into the union to handle, like if you were a union official and you were assigned to handling grievances,
Mm-hmm.
but the person that you were going to handle the grievance for would take your position on the floor and make your job more difficult, or take all of your benefits from you, then you have an underlying reason to not assist that person. But I think we're getting, you know, more about me and less about the telestaff and the sophistication of the stuff that the public needs to know about.
So let's talk about that then. Tell us what we need to know, because you have gone through extreme measures to try to bring awareness to this topic, and you've had the door shut in your face for what, 12 plus years now?
Well, 2006, I tried going to the FBI. I met there countless times with FBI agent Allison Ryan, and we went over all of the stuff to make sure that uh, when the formal complaints were filed in the union and the politicians and the necessary people within the union, the first responders who've taken over the union, they were named correctly in all the formal complaints, and it could be submitted to Washington, D.C. That's when I tried to do more than I could do on my own, you know, versus just going down to the health department and see why are these people being issued
Mm-hmm.
EMS licenses by falsifying F-18 and F-15 reports, and none of the people, not even the instructor, are licensed to teach these classes that they're paying people for. So I wasn't getting anywhere. Every door I went to was closed. I tried going to different lawyers, only to find out later these lawyers that I thought I was going to like get protection to be like a whistleblower.
Mm-hmm.
I learned later those were the lawyers connected to the union over the years. And as most people who get better with the internet and today's technology, you get smart pretty quick. You figure stuff out. You know, I didn't know a lot of this stuff. I just wanted to be a fireman when I was a little kid. And now you see the sophistication and just how out of hand stuff can get. And you can look at things like warnings like Eisenhower gave us, the be aware of the military industrial complex,
Mm-hmm.
the outsider who wants to do war for profit, or how can this benefit me, or follow the money, that kind of thing. So what I did was I ended up at the FBI, and as the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act grew more and more, as I would visit the FBI over on Lake Mead, the fences got higher, the bulletproof glass got thicker, the barbed wire got bigger, and then next thing I know, after I had been there a couple of times, there was a not really a foyer, but like a little heavy duty box with two armed guys in it. And it got to the point where I couldn't go in with a piece of paper and a pen to make notes. I couldn't take a driver's license in there. I had to have my pockets empty. Your phone would be taken from you before you were allowed into the main building. And once you were allowed in the main building, one of the strangest things I remember about being in the FBI building at that time was in the lobby. They had a large display of FBI employees who had been killed in action or killed on the job.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read the history of each one of them, I would say over 80% of them was the person accidentally had killed themselves, or their coworker had accidentally killed them. It was the strangest history I'd ever seen. This employee was riding in the car, and the other employee's gun went off, and this person, it was really bizarre. And that was something I remember reading many times when I went to the FBI in order to meet with this lady. And the lady would come out, and we would sit in the lobby and go over stuff. Well, what do you want to do today? What, we better make sure that these sentences are written in this manner. And then finally we got everything broke down to where it was ready to be submitted as a formal complaint. The formal complaint was submitted to the FBI. She explained that it would go to Washington, D.C., where it would be assigned a case number, and then a short time later, I would be contacted back. So after 6-7 months went by, I didn't hear anything, so I tried to go there again, and they were like, there's no person here by that name. There's no Allison Ryan here.
So that's Allison Ryan is the
FBI agent that I had met many times there.
And she no longer works there.
They were like, this person, just was a runaround. And then the last time I was there, they sent 2 big goons out that just said, look, if you don't leave, we're going to escort you out the hard way. So I left the lobby, walked back to that little bulletproof booth thing to pick up my phone and my pencil and my paper, and that was the last time I had gone there.
What were you hoping to accomplish? What were you trying to bring
make the public aware of the telestaff software, or whatever software these public employee labor unions are using across the country or in your jurisdiction that's bankrupting your community. Like, for example, that same legislator who makes sure that the laws are in place that no one can look at the fire department's salary or pay, also approved the $3 billion gas tax annually here to help fund those pensions. And his argument was, no one's really going to feel the hit of $3 billion anyways. And that's the justifier for the public employees labor unions falsifying their work and salary and pension records, is that the other people who are stuck funding it aren't going to really realize the financial hit. And that seems like the wrong excuse to justify stealing money. And as you've seen in every Ponzi scheme, it just keeps building until the little guy at the bottom, and then finally the one guy can't. And we're at that phase now where there isn't enough money coming in to fund it, and people don't realize just how many trillions of dollars this is. For example, CalPERS did studies and found out that the danger level of the fire department job, like they try to argue, well, our job is the most dangerous. They did studies and found that the fire department job is equal to a grocery cashier, and the dangerous jobs are loggers, taxi cab drivers, 7-Eleven night shift. There's some real dangerous jobs, and
firefighters do not rank number 1, is what you're saying.
Well, it's not that they rank number 1. Their argument to justify their pay, is always addressed. Like, well, we're heroes, so we're entitled to the money we steal. And when you look under the fraud triangle, these 3 things have to be in place, and one of those is entitlement. Where the person is, if you look up the FBI's research on the fraud triangle, you'll see that the key element is this entitlement. And the people they hire are the ones who easily drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and are bred to, we're entitled, that kind of a thing.
And you never took advantage of this software?
It never really got a chance to get going. When I saw what was happening and I started to speak up, that's when I got the backlash. And no matter how hard I tried to get to the bottom of it, or no matter what agency I went to locally, I got nowhere with it. And one of the key elements that you'll realize when you read what allows a company to be a 501c3 nonprofit organization is they must refrain from getting involved in politics, or they lose their tax exempt status. But every time a commercial comes on, it'll say the firemen have decided that we need to vote yes or no on question this or that, because and you can't do that.
So they're in violation of their own policies.
Yes. But back in the day when I was on the fire department, we weren't trying to see how much money we could steal from the public. We just provided a service and did what we did. And nowadays, the public is starting to realize that, why are we broke? Why is the property tax so high? Why can't I make ends meet? Well, it's because you're stuck funding taxpayer-funded government employee pensions. And right now, it's in the trillions of dollars. And you would need a forensic accountant to really get in and open up the books, because the first thing that you're going to see happen there'll be a fire, let's say, and all the records got lost, and they can't be looked into. But the sophistication is this: if a fireman, they did studies and they find the average fireman lives to 80, 90, or 100 years, but they retired at 43, and each one of their pay raises every 4 years was 6%. And you initially started with a $20,000 a month pension, you could see how quickly it could add up to a huge amount. And then the person is hired back for a second pension, a third pension, a fourth pension. And the public that doesn't get no pension, doesn't receive no benefit from funding them, can't figure out why they can't live a better life, and they have to start eating macaroni and cheese, and they'll put $3 in the gas tank instead of 10 because they can't make ends meet. And just like when you saw last week where they said they're going to put a tax on texting, and that is so that the government can provide a service to someone who really shouldn't get it. We need to tax texting so we can buy cell phones to give to the illegal immigrants coming in through the caravan before they get into the U.S. so they can have necessary phones. When you look at it, the Constitution says under Title 8, no government official can aid any illegal in any way, or it's an automatic felony, which invalidates them to even hold office. But I'm already off track from the salary and pensions.
No, not really, because it's a great example of how we see fraud and constitutional violations in ways that people might consider benign, but really it does cause a financial impact and devastation to the taxpayer ultimately, is what's happening. So as a regular Joe Schmo tax-paying citizen, which is illegal in and of itself, but that's a topic for another time, what can the taxpayer do in order to demand transparency with this software and what's going on? What can we do as listeners to support you and encourage transparency?
Okay. Well, in the late 90s, in the late 90s, I went to an individual here. He was a politician and a lawyer. His name was Tix Seegerblum. And he's popular here in Nevada now because he's behind the legalization of the marijuana.
Okay.
Well, I did not know who he was at the time, and I thought going to him would help me establish the necessary groundwork to blow the whistle on this criminal activity within the fire department. Only later did I learn that he was the lawyer for the fire union lobbyist, plus he was the legislator in Carson City that put the laws on the books to make it impossible for the public to see how they were being ripped off by the fire unions. And you can't have that. I'm trying to find the way to put it where no matter where you go, you can't go public. You can't get the word out because no matter where you go, there's somebody there. And then how I learned of you was I tried reaching out to that Cody Snodgrass guy because he was very knowledgeable. And he spoke of the Promise software. And I was trying to figure out, no matter where I went, if I spent a whole bunch of money, hired a lawyer, put a whole bunch of paperwork together, and got it into court, the first thing that would happen is it would get assigned to this judge who was part of a Promise software, and they would simply dismiss the case. They wouldn't even let you be heard.
Okay.
And then Another form of software was the Roman software when I worked at Fire Station 17. They had this Roman software that, let's say we went on a call, the patient presented with these vital signs and passed away because we didn't arrive in time. Okay, let's just say, for example. So what I would do, fill out the report. This was a patient's vital signs. We arrived at this time. We did this, and this, and we cleared the scene. The Roman software let your supervisor go in to that same report and change it. And they would write, we were canceled en route. We never made it to the call. The patient never was seen. And AMR or Southwest or one of the ambulance services handled. So this went on for 2-3 years at the station. And I was trying to figure out what was going on. When I eventually learned what was going on, my supervisor had started a funeral home business, and his goal was to get the maximum amount of dead bodies for his funeral home business. So he was benefiting from these dead bodies. You know, we get a call, we better get going. You know, hey boss, let's get going. And we can't even leave the station because she's not ready to go yet. Let's take it. And then dispatch would tone the station out another time. And then the third.
Okay, I'm really trying hard to process this information right now because it seems so unbelievable. I want to recap and make sure I have it correct. So this Roman software allows the captain or whomever to go in, alter the records, allowing for a misrepresentation of the facts deliberately. And then at the same time, because he had a side business, a funeral, he was literally allowing individuals to die, suffer and die by whatever means, smoke inhalation, fire, what have you.
Medical calls. Let's say you had a heart attack.
So that he had more dead bodies for his funeral home?
Yes. And then when he wasn't getting enough dead bodies, he went to the county commission and argued that he needs to be put in the rotation more so he can get more of these dead bodies.
Who is this man?
His name is Chris Blackburn, and he owns the La Paloma Funeral Home. And so I took all of my reports. I had a whole bunch of 1,000-milers full of medical reports that they had altered. And I met with Al Osborne, who was the chief, my chief at the time, and to make sure that he could get a good scope of what was going on, I asked him if I could meet him at the Clark County Library on Flamingo. Went there, they let us use a large multi-purpose room, and it had these big tables in it. So I put all the run sheets out there, and I said, this is what's going on. This is what Chris Blackburn's doing. And this is what, and he just stuck his fingers in his ears, turned around, and he was like, I don't want to hear this. And he just started walking.
So, and tell me his name again.
Al Osborne.
Al Osborne
was the chief that didn't want to know what the funeral home business was doing out of the station.
But technically he knows, and he's deliberately choosing to ignore the situation and allow these deaths and frauds to take place.
Basically. But he's done that on more than one occasion. Another time I needed him to review a contractual thing on the, you know, to bid a station, it's based on seniority. And if a station comes open, you submit a form and you bid over to it. When you get over there and you find out it's ran by the first responders and they don't want to do the job that they're paid to do, and you go over and you get in the middle of it, you get backlash from it. The same people that you're hoping will approve your meningitis record release are the same people withholding it so that you can't work on the floor and take their easy position away. And to get to the bottom of it, you have to notify a supervisor. The supervisor was Al Osborne again at that time because the main battalion chief had been injured. He was off on vacation and got a broken collarbone, so he had to take 3 years off of workers' comp for something that had nothing to do with work. But what it does is it allows the telestaff software to create 3 years of overtime vacancies for the other guys. And that's why it takes place.
This is shocking. And I'm surprised that nobody has wanted to speak with you, but then when you understand paid opposition and how that works, I can see how you've had every door slammed in your face. Because everybody's getting a payoff somewhere.
It's sophisticated. You know, like I tried going to the guy who's the governor now, Sisolak. Went to him over a decade ago and tried it. And he goes, I'll help. And then as soon as I tell him what's going on, he's like, I'm not going to help. And then I do remember reading some records where when he was on the county commission board, they approved the sale of the Bundy land, the Bundy Ranch. A while back, Senator Richard Bryan and Harry Reid, these were senators here in Nevada, they were involved with a law firm called the Lionel Sawyer Collins Law Firm. And that law firm took a client that wanted the Bundy's ranch. So they sold the ranch that didn't belong to them. Senator Bryan and Harry Reid, they sold the guy's ranch to a Chinese investor for $3.4 million. So they had the county commissioners reappraise Bundy's ranch for $3.4 million when the ranch is valued 70, 80 million. And when I looked through those records, they clearly showed where the county commission themselves were nervous looking at this information and still being asked to rule in favor of the sale of this person's land. Later on, they weren't able to take this man's land. So what they did was they filed for bankruptcy, and the Lionel Sawyer Collins dissolved, owing the $3.4 million to the client. And you can read that easily, where the Lionel Sawyer Collins law firm files for bankruptcy and folds up. But you know, that's another discussion for another day. But looking through the records, Sisolak and the majority of people on the county commission board, when I looked through it, approved the sale of the guy's land that they didn't own, and then they fabricated a story that he had impacted the tortoises, and that was the justifier to take this guy's land.
How prevalent is that, do you feel? I know the Bundy case is a high profile case, but
well, what I'm saying is the judges that get those cases, like the lady that was the judge for the Bundy thing, when you read the history of her as she came up through the Boyd School of Law at UNLV, the praises that Harry Reid and Senator Bryan gave her on her way up, her accolades, and then her main case is this one where her first statement is, I will not allow the Constitution in my courtroom.
Oh my God.
And
I can't believe nobody called her on that.
Well,
that's appalling.
You know, when you look at Marbury versus Madison, all laws repugnant to the Constitution are automatically void. And that's the Supreme Court ruling. There's no law higher than the Constitution. But every time you try to speak up, they're like, well, that doesn't apply to you. That's just corporations that are impersonating as people. You know, that's another topic as well. But
it is, because technically in Black's Law, I think it's volume 4, it's either 4 or 6, person is described as a corporation.
It's a legal person. But my point is this: if the criminal has the power in today's sophisticated software-driven world to put a judge in place, or a head of the FBI, or a person in any taxpayer-funded government labor union position job, because that's what the acronym agencies are, the FBI, the DEA, the CIA, they're all taxpayer-funded agencies, and they have labor unions, and just no different than the fire department union. But they obstruct justice to make sure that the criminal never gets caught. And it's so sophisticated that it needs software to stay on top of it. So in order to track each person, you're labeled with a number. And if that person makes waves, they assign them a number, enter them into the promised software, for example, And then no matter where that person goes, the software is right there one step ahead of them to dismiss the case after you've put every penny together to try to get something to get your voice heard. Or you've been discredited in some way, or they've taken another software program that if someone tried to look into your background, they'd say he was mentally ill and he's one sandwich short of a picnic or whatever. They're trying to do anything to just make sure they themselves don't get caught when they're the criminal.
Yeah.
And the promise software, I often wondered if the federal judge Roger Hunt or the judge Valerie Adair or her family, or how these people kept getting these cases when the judge that was put in charge of the case wasn't even certified in that jurisdiction to hear such a case. And it tells
So these
me
cases were being put in front of judges that had no jurisdiction. That's what you're saying.
They dismiss the case. For example, like let's say I'm finally going to get a day in court, and for ease of simplicity, let's just say all the records on the JFK assassination are going to be released, and then it's pending this judge's approval. So it gets to him and he says, oh, I decided 1.3% of the information is going to be released, or I'm going to dismiss the case and we'll be right where we were 45 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The judge shouldn't be a taxpayer-funded government employee with a taxpayer-funded pension and retirement working against the taxpayer. And that's what's taking place today, like whether it's Hillary Clinton being protected by the State Department or the FBI. And when you look at the people that are in charge of the FBI, you'll find that they were employees at HSBC Bank that handled the Clinton Foundation money. And then Loretta Lynch and Comey both left HSBC Bank for their government jobs. And now they're standing in the way of looking into the records of HSBC Bank.
So there's a conflict of interest for sure. On
steroids. It's sophisticated, but the reason for the software, the new crime of the century is software, is it gives plausible deniability, allows the person to say, it wasn't me, the software broke the law, put it in jail, when the software only does what the human programmed it to do, if that makes sense.
But ultimately, I mean, you can blame it on the software, but you know when you're getting overpaid. I mean, when you've got a paycheck coming in for $100,000 a month because they're taking advantage of all these double dipping opportunities because of the software, you know as a person that that's fraudulent.
Right. Let me say a little bit more about the promise software. When the people who wrote it, the Hamiltons wrote it, let's say they were mathematicians at Harvard or Yale, wherever they were, they wrote this software. They wrote it for the government. They took it to the government to do exactly what they were told to do. And then the government said, no, we're not going to buy it. A couple of years later, he starts getting a whole bunch of phone calls. I need technical support and repair and warranty. And he's like, what are you talking about? I never sold it. Well, a copy of it did, and it got sold to everybody. And the only reason why he learned his software had been stolen and hijacked was the technical service calls he started to get from all over the world for it.
Wow. So they stole his idea.
They, how do you get around patents or whatever? You just, oh, that's national security, or you change the color of the booklet and so it allows it to circumvent patents. I don't, it's a whole other topic. For example, the guy I went to that wrote the law for the U.S. government on racketeering,
mm-hmm.
He was in town to meet with Richard Bryan and Harry Reid to make sure that they didn't get caught for ethics violations. And when I talked to him then, trying to go forward with all this, he was like, go to the FBI. And I said, well, I've already been there. And he's like, well, this sounds deeper than I want to get into. And I said, well, is there anything you can do? And he's like, well, at this point, I don't really want to tell you. Well, why are you in town? Well, I'm meeting with Harry Reid and Richard Bryan so they don't get caught for ethics violations and racketeering. And that was when they were taking the Bundy's land. And so when the guy retired as a government employee, he
Hmm.
got tenure out of college. I can't think of the guy's name, but you could look it up. The guy who wrote the racketeering law for the United States government.
Okay.
That's this guy. I got his emails. I want to say it's yale.edu or something. And once he saw just how much money is being stolen by the fire unions across the country, he didn't want to touch it. Didn't want to get involved with it at all. He was like, oh, I'll wash my hands of it and you have a nice day.
So what needs to happen in order to stop this Ponzi scheme? You mentioned a forensic accountant. So you need somebody with those types of skills to contact you, correct? Or to at least start looking into it. What else do you need?
Right. Well, one of the things I did, there was a guy, his name was Harry Markopoulos, and he exposed the Bernie Madoff fraud. Harry Markopoulos was a forensic fraud investigator type guy. He worked for another hedge fund place, and the guy said, how is this guy able to get these level of returns? So they looked into it and found out it was a scam. Well, it took Harry Markopoulos, I'm trying to reach this guy. So finally he wrote a book. Look, they wouldn't listen to me. I took 15 years and they wouldn't listen to me. And the name of his book is Nobody Would Listen. So I reached out to him, his lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I would have to get the emails to see the name, but he has since then, he's got another agency where he's working, kind of doing sort of what I'm doing. But when I reached out to them, his office secretary called me back and she goes, because who's involved here? She goes, I don't want to touch this. We don't want to touch this because it's the fire department and everyone sees the fire departments as, heroes, but it's more of a marketing, back when my grandfather did the work or my father did the work or my uncles who are all retired. My brother just retired with 35 years on, and he's still in the hospital now with cancer. What do you do? How do you get the public to learn of such a horrific thing when the public has been programmed to see these people as heroes, and anytime you question them, they'll be like, how dare you? I'm the hero. I am a hero and deserve.
I think we use that term way too loosely. Just because you're a firefighter, just because you're in the military, just because you're a police officer.
Well, the military is different. In my opinion, maybe the firemen shouldn't be paid any more than the military, because the soldiers are in danger and they're away from their families for a lot. The firemen have elected to take the job, and in my opinion today, with today's fire service and fire sprinklers and fire prevention sophistication and software that helps put out fires and annunciator panels and so on and so forth, there's no need to sleep at the stations anymore. There's no horse-drawn fire pump where you have to clean the front wheels of the horse-drawn carriage at 10 p.m. each evening. And then when you ask a fireman today, why are you washing the front wheels on the fire engine today? And they say, well, we've been doing it for the last 100 years. Yeah, that's because when the horse pooped on the ground, the wheels rolled through it. And that's the truth, though. When you look into it, it's 100 years of past practice. That's why we're washing the front wheels on the fire truck at 10 at night.
So how much money annually do you think is being paid out to these firefighters in a fraudulent way? I'm not talking about their base salary that they're entitled to. I'm talking about the
impact on the public, you mean?
Uh-huh.
The public is paying about 8 to 10 fire departments. The cost equal to about 8 to 10 fire departments. And as the cost of living adjustments are added into each retiree and the person's hired back for a second or a third or a fourth pension, it could quickly escalate to 30 times the cost of a fire department, especially when you add in the task force and the FEMA activation phases. Individuals have to abandon their station locally and fly off to some place to render aid. I'll give you an example.
Well, let's finish with that though first before you go into the example. Would you say that we're talking billions or trillions?
Oh, it's trillions.
Trillions. Okay.
they're going to argue no. They're going to say that we save the public money when it's exact opposite. I don't know if you've seen the war-related strategies where you immediately blame your opponent of exactly what you're guilty of.
Oh, sure.
Linsky practices, he was doing that, you've seen it.
Oh, I have. Saul Alinsky is a perfection. He's a picture of perfection with that, and the Democrats use that strategy. I'm not going to get into politics here, but they specifically use those strategies.
Yeah, you project what you're doing wrong onto your opponent, and
Yep.
then throw in a bunch of Hegelian dialectic minutia, and then at the tail end of that, you have this pre-written solution already ready to go, ready to be approved by the politicians, and that solution every time is higher taxes and more government
and less freedom.
Yes.
Okay, so go back to your example before I interrupted you.
Oh boy, you have to give me a second. Sometimes when this is overwhelming to try to tell you what's important versus what may not be important to the listener.
Okay, so while you're thinking of the example, I want you to tell the viewers, if you can, how this has impacted your life in terms of no pension, they've denied you your pension, and with you trying to shed light on the situation, they've really drug you through the mud.
Well, the main problem that I have is I can't get any answers. Nobody wants to tell me anything. Even when my father passed away and I was at a funeral and a couple of guys said, that those guys fired you on paper to prevent you from being promoted to a supervisor position. I was like, what are you talking about? And they said, well, they fired you so that they could promote the people behind you on a promotions list. So you were technically terminated on paper, but you were coming to work. If you look through the PERS records, you will see this. So I took a newspaper reporter down to the PERS record office to try to, and oh man, it got bad. And then the second time we went down there a few weeks later, they were already ready for us. It's like they knew we were coming. And the lady in charge there said, you're not getting nothing. And the newspaper reporter, his name is Glenn Cook, he said he had a Freedom of Information Act thing or something from Carson City that would allow him to get my records. And the lady said, look, we called the fire union, you're not to get anything.
Wow.
So that's
so you're paying the price for the truth.
I don't know. I worked there 20 years and I made $78,000 a year. I was living in a 5,000 square foot house and had more than enough money to make ends meet.
And now?
I have nothing. I tried to, after the bank took the house and foreclosed, the constable came and evicted me and said, if you set foot on the property again, you'll immediately go to jail. I had an undercover cop come to the front of the house. He kept saying things like, the fire department ain't gonna help you. I'm just talking to the sky. He just kept looking up like I got like a veiled warning. And then after I was gone, no money coming in, can't afford the medical coverage to get the meningitis care looked in, nothing. So
Patrick, as we wrap this up, what are the main points that the average taxpayer / viewer needs to be aware of? What can they do? Write their legislatures?
Well, if you do write the legislature, you'll find that the legislature's children are on the fire department. That's one of the things you will see is these groups of people look after their own, so to speak, and they make sure that if somebody's going to get voted into office, it's someone that's not going to bring scrutiny upon them. And that's the negative impact of today's computer-based world. For example, in the old days, if you were going to have an election, there was a ballot and you cast it and you had a receipt. But now if you cast your ballot, it goes into a privately owned computer. The computer has maybe software in it, maybe it doesn't, where it either throws your vote away because you voted in the wrong direction, or it says you voted for the party you didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Those are topics for another day as well. And that lady I spoke to in Washington, her name is Bev Harris at Black Box Voting. I tried to go to her to see if she could help. I've reached out so many different directions, stuff that probably even seems irrelevant to my topic,
Mm-hmm.
to get help to go public. Other independent news agencies, like the What Really Happened radio show, or the John Statmiller RBN, or Alex Jones even. And as soon as they find out that it's the fire department stealing money, they don't want to touch it. They're like, that's
So
cut into our listener base. Our donations will fall. And
is it fair to say that just because you're a firefighter doesn't mean you are taking advantage of the system? We don't want to throw
you can't not nowadays. You can't not, because of the software and the implications of the people who will go down when it does come out. They made it mandatory that everybody takes it. So when it goes down, everyone's involved. Initially, it was just going to be the people who were receiving rescue pay. They started to cook the books. And then they came up with something called in-house callbacks, where only their station could take a callback. They could give it to themselves, and nobody else could take a callback at their station. And now it's got so sophisticated that those in-house callback guys, they can take a call at your station, but you can't take one at their station. And their books are written in a manner that it's pencil, so to speak, so it can't be looked into.
So is it possible to know this? Obviously, they're using the software. That's just part of the way the system is set up. Is it possible to use the system and not take advantage of it? Or do you feel like that is
if
very
you went into
rare?
a hospital, you would see there's Kronos software that shows where a nurse is anywhere on the floor or whatever. And there's police departments who are just starting to buy into the Kronos software because they see how much the firemen can make with it. So they want their local community, their taxpayers locally, to buy the software for them so they can turn the money wheel for themselves. The funny thing is the taxpayers are buying the software so that the taxpayer-funded public employees labor union can steal money from the taxpayer who is stuck purchasing the software. And then they put legislation in place, like from Tick Seeger-Bloom and other individuals who are directly connected to the fire union. They put laws on the books so you can't audit the books.
So this is really like a Ponzi virus. Instead of the powers that be and law enforcement departments recognizing that this is a scam, a fraudulent system, and stopping it, they're getting on board with the software so they can replicate what the firemen are doing and take advantage of the system themselves. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'll give you an example. If the cop who has to go out and sit in his cruiser and drive a 8 or a 10-hour shift in his car, but the firemen are at work sitting in the recliner watching the TV because they only go when there's a call. It would be like a school teacher who had to go into work each day and get in the recliner and make some food and sit around. They don't. It's just the depending on how busy your station is, you can be busy or not. One of the problems in New York they initially had with the first responders trying to say, well, we have to give these paramedics more freedom and more rights and more power. How New York handled, they just said, let's do it this way. We're going to split the two agencies in half. The paramedic department is it, and you run only paramedic calls, and the firemen only do that. And that way it stopped the game. And what I was saying earlier about the firemen only working 8 hours a shift versus sleeping at the station.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, when you had to get to the fire station, get the horse connected, get the horse-drawn carriage out and down the street, you had to sleep in the station to reduce the time. But with sprinkler systems and today's fire prevention, it's not needed. The average, you could take a 24-hour shift and split it into 3 8-hour shifts, give the firemen an 8-hour shift, hire 3 times the people, and no overtime. You would put 3 times the amount of Americans to work they'd all be heroes technically, but the
Whose term?
public, well, I don't know if you look up the word hero in the dictionary, if it says person who accelerates his overtime benefits and boosts and spikes his, I don't know if it reads that way, but I don't think they're funded
Yeah.
to hero or volunteer. I don't think, but to try to loop every fireman into being a criminal, that's not the goal here. What
Right.
happened is the union was infiltrated by first responders with a goal of stealing. And
Mhm.
in order to not get caught, they had to bring everybody in. So
Okay.
they changed the wording to where the average person couldn't take a day off. They have what's called mandatory callbacks now. So when everyone gets caught, there isn't the guy who said, I didn't want to take the callback. Because when you look into it, it says mandatory now. You can't not take it. And that's so that the 10 or 15 people upstairs that are being paid for what you're supposed to be called back for, they
Mhm.
don't do it. So they hire the 16th person back at overtime rate so that the 15 up there don't have to do it,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Well, what I'm going to hope is that if anybody has information on this subject, whether you're a firefighter, friends, family of firefighters, and you can speak on this knowledgeably, I would love to have your comments. I always ask two things: be polite, provide facts. Okay, so
Okay.
that way we can have an open dialogue. So I'm asking you viewers, if you have any information on this, especially if you feel like you can be of help to Patrick, shedding light on this topic, that you contact me at galacticstoryteller@gmail.com. I do know from talking with Patrick that he does need some assistance in helping bring this to light and getting to the problem of this, or getting to the bottom of this, because this is becoming an internal virus, not just within the fire department, but as you say, it's making its way into other aspects of first responder units, correct?
Yes, when you hear the word first responder, you're hearing the lobbyists hired by the fire union to market
Right.
themselves. Anytime you hear a story, it's to in an indirect way justify their extreme costs.
Right.
But when you look at it, at one time the public could afford the fire department, but after the advent of the computer and the cell phone,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly that fire department that the public could once afford, they can't now. And
So when the firefighters are standing at the intersection on our community roads with their boots asking for donations and then giving you little cheap plastic firefighter hats, what are they collecting donations for? What is this about? And
there's
what do they do with the
there's
money?
more than one of those organizations. In our local community, they had the burn fund, and then they had the muscular dystrophy boot drive. And that individual I was telling you about before that just got elected to governor, I was trying to explain to him at one time, Sisolak is the guy's name, and thinking that he could help me.
Okay.
And I explained to him, it's not right for the fire engine to be out of its first in response area, sitting at an intersection with nobody in it, when a fire truck has no lockable doors. They're not like a car where the door is locked. So the SOP and the rule and regulations is the engineer must stay with the fire equipment at all times, because there's no way to lock it. But the running through the traffic and putting a set of tennis shoes on to make it safer than the steel-toed boots that they're now having to wear when there's no reason for it. That's a whole other topic in and of itself. Regarding clothing allowances, $3,000 a year to buy new uniforms, and they boosted it $600 more so that they could buy steel-toed boots. And then when you get a fire, the first thing you do is you take the steel-toed safety boot off and leave it and put your fire department turnouts that you already bought in the first place on.
So they're collecting that money for their
It's
use.
clothing allowance, just like you would see in any other, like the police or whatever. You receive a clothing allowance, but the union was able to find a way to accelerate it and put more money in their pockets. So one of the things they did was they approved for steel-toed boots, And then if you go by the station, once you're inside the locked doors, the stations used to be able to walk up to any fire station. Hey, can I maybe get a glass of water? Or can you take a blood pressure cuff for my grandma? Just a quick, brief vital signs thing. You can't do that anymore. The fire stations aren't really open to the public. They're surrounded by barbed wire and motorized gates, and they're considerably different than you might remember in the 60s or 70s. It's just different. And in order to justify more calls on the books, to say they've been running lots of calls, they don't want you to do a walk-in. They want it generated so that when you look at the end of the year, it looks like the fire station ran 8,000 calls. And then you find out later that 7,900 of them were canceled en routes or never left the station, didn't even start the fire truck, but it was toned out so that it looks on paper as though they ran a lot of calls.
I think that's very shocking and alarming, and I think we should all be concerned about this. Really, I do, because it is costing us so much money, and I don't like to be lied to, period. And so when we don't have transparency of where our taxpayer dollars are going, I think that's a real problem, because it gives a great opportunity for these organizations to defraud the public, which obviously they are doing and have been for quite some time.
Yeah,
So I thank you for being willing to come out and share this information with us, because I know that you have paid a huge price for that.
Well, you're the one that needs to be thanked, because you have the platform, and every other person that I've gone to doesn't want to hear it. They view it as a different than you have. But once people see what's going on,
I hope they feel otherwise, and I hope they become proactive. Do you want the viewers to be able to contact you, or would you rather have them contact me and then I'll let you know?
Well, if they contacted you, you would stay in the loop and you would be aware of the direction it goes, since
Sure.
You've taken the biggest risk, because you have the platform that reaches the viewers. And I don't know how to explain it other than,
okay,
even in high school, I never even took a typing class. What are the needs that you'd ever have to type? And then someone invented the computer and everyone has a keyboard.
Right. Okay.
A lot of people go to college and they're more educated than me.
Well, I think you're quite knowledgeable on this topic, and that's why you're speaking on it. So I appreciate that. So let's do this. Viewers, if you can help Patrick in any way, you can shed some light on the situation, or you can help bring this problem to a solution that works for the firefighters as well as the taxpayers in an honest way, please contact me at galacticstoryteller@gmail.com. I will be the liaison here and get you in contact with Patrick, so hopefully we can bring a resolution to this multi-trillion-dollar problem and Ponzi scheme, which we do not want to see. I thank you, Patrick, for your time and for the knowledge and the light that you're trying to shed on this topic. I do appreciate that very much. So let's go ahead and wrap that up. And as new information comes to light, we will bring updates to the viewers on this. Stay in contact with me. I know I'll be in contact with you. So viewers, there you have it. Information on the firefighters Ponzi scheme that's going on, that's costing us all. And we need to help bring our economic status to the United States back to a checks and balance. And we can only do that through transparency. So you can reach me at galacticstoryteller.com. Leave your comments, like and subscribe. The only thing that I'll ask with the comments, be polite, provide facts so that we can have a reasonable and respectful dialogue. That's all I ask. So I appreciate your viewership, especially to you subscribers. Thank you for tuning in today. And as always, have a great day, and we will see you in the next video.